Chapter 1. The Key Graham Never Explained. My husband died on a Tuesday morning, and before the funeral flowers even arrived, his family started telling everyone I was too emotional to handle the money and that the house should probably be sold before I made a mistake. Within a week, they were already planning the sale, filing paperwork against the title, and acting like everything Daniel owned now belonged to them. What they didn't know was that months earlier, my husband had quietly moved money into an account only I could access and left documents proving every dollar they claimed was already paid back. When the county investigator opened their lien filing, it exposed something even bigger. A loan application where his brother had already promised the bank money from selling a house he didn't own. At 7:42 on a Thursday morning, the investigator called my attorney, and 2 weeks later, the same paperwork that was supposed to take my home triggered a fraud investigation that could send him to prison. My name is Alara Whitmore, and this is the story of how my husband's family tried to steal my house after his funeral, and how their own paperwork became the revenge they never saw coming. The house finally went quiet late Sunday evening. That was the moment I found the key my husband never told me about. The last car from the memorial had just pulled away from the driveway. A pale strip of sunset still hung over the quiet street in Franklin, Tennessee. For 3 days, the house had been filled with people moving through the rooms, carrying food, whispering condolences, touching my arm like they were afraid I might collapse if they spoke too loudly. Now the driveway was empty. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the sink full of casserole dishes neighbors had brought. Aluminum trays covered in foil, paper plates stacked beside the counter. Someone had written their name on a plastic lid with a black marker so I would know where to return it later. I knew I should start cleaning. Instead, I just stood there. My name is Alara Whitmore. I am 42 years old. 3 days ago, my husband died in a hospital room 20 minutes from this house. My husband, Daniel Whitmore, was 45. He ran logistics operations for a regional distribution company called Southern Ridge Freight, the kind of job that meant early mornings and late phone calls, but Daniel never complained about it. He liked order. He liked knowing where things were supposed to go and how they were supposed to get there. At home, he was the same way. Tools organized in the garage, bills paid the day they arrived, grocery lists written in neat handwriting and taped to the refrigerator. Daniel was not the kind of man who left mysteries behind. Pulmonary embolism. That was the phrase the doctor used. A blood clot that traveled to his lungs. One moment, he had been texting me about picking up milk on the way home. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a hospital hallway while a doctor explained that sometimes the body simply fails without warning. Since then, everything had blurred together. Hospital forms, insurance calls, the quiet efficiency of the funeral home, Daniel's mother crying softly in the living room while his sister tried to comfort her. Everyone kept telling me I was being strong. The truth was simpler. I had not had time to break down yet. But now the house was empty, and the silence pressed against my ears. I turned off the kitchen light and walked upstairs. The hallway smelled faintly like the cedar soap Daniel used every morning. I had never noticed how much that scent lingered until now. Our bedroom door was half open. The bed was still unmade the morning he went to work. His pillow carried the faint outline of where his head used to rest. I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the nightstand. That was when I noticed the key. It lay beside the lamp like someone had placed it deliberately. Not a house key, not a car key, a heavy brass key with a thick stem and an ornate head, the kind that looked like it belonged in an old courthouse door. Daniel did not collect antique keys. He did not leave objects lying around without purpose. He was methodical to the point of obsession. Everything in our house had a place. Everything had a reason. I picked up the key. It felt heavier than I expected. Underneath it sat a white envelope. My name was written across the front in Daniel's careful handwriting, Ilara. My chest tightened. Daniel rarely wrote letters. If he needed to tell me something, he simply said it. Seeing my name written that way made my stomach twist with a strange kind of dread. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Daniel's handwriting again. "If anything ever happens to me, everything in the box is yours. Do not let anyone take it." That was the entire message. No explanation, no instructions, just those 2 sentences. I read them 3 times before I even realized I was holding my breath. Everything in the box. What box? Then the memory surfaced. 6 months earlier, Daniel had come home carrying a small fireproof lockbox. He had set it on the closet floor and said it was for important paperwork. Estate documents, insurance policies, the boring adult things that Daniel always handled better than I did. At the time, I had barely paid attention. Daniel managed most of our financial paperwork and estate documents. I trusted him to take care of those details the way he always had. Now, I stood slowly and walked toward the closet. The lockbox sat exactly where I remembered it. Black metal, compact, heavy enough that it did not slide when I nudged it with my hand. I held the brass key over the lock. For a moment, my hand hesitated. Opening that box felt like stepping into something I was not ready to face. But Daniel left the key for me, which meant he wanted me to look. I slid the key into the lock. It turned easily. The lid opened with a quiet metallic click. Inside were 3 things: a folded property document, a printed investment statement, and another sealed envelope. I reached for the document first. The paper was thick and stamped with a seal of a county recorder's office. Property location, Lake Hartville, Georgia. A small lakeside cabin. Owner listed on the deed, Elara Whitmore. I stared at the name for several seconds before the meaning settled. My name. Not Daniel and Elara, just me. I flipped through the document again to make sure I had misunderstood. But the deed was clear. The cabin had been purchased in late 2020, 3 years ago. Daniel had bought a house and never told me. My pulse started to quicken. I reached for the investment statement next. The account belonged to a brokerage firm called Northgate Capital. The balance, $312,000. Primary account holder, Elara Whitmore. My hands began to tremble slightly. Daniel and I had always talked openly about money, retirement plans, mortgage payments, savings goals, but I had never seen this account before. I leaned back against the closet wall, trying to process what I was seeing. A hidden cabin, a 6-figure investment account, and a letter telling me not to let anyone take it. The second envelope waited quietly in the box. I opened it carefully. The letter inside began with a nickname only Daniel ever used, Ellie. If you are reading this, something has gone wrong. The handwriting was steady, but the words carried a weight I could feel in my chest. Daniel wrote about an argument he had with his brother Nathan several years earlier after his father passed. The family had sold a piece of farmland outside Knoxville that had belonged to their parents for decades. Nathan believed the sale price had been too low. He insisted Daniel had rushed the decision. The disagreement had turned ugly. Voices raised, accusations about money. Daniel wrote that the argument changed the way he looked at certain people. Sometimes money shows you who someone really is. That sentence stayed with me. The letter continued. That is why I started putting certain things aside for you. The cabin and the investment account are in your name for a reason. Please do not mention them to my family. Not yet. I lowered the paper slowly. Through the floor, I could hear quiet voices drifting from the living room. Daniel's mother, his brother, his sister. Earlier, I assumed they were downstairs sharing stories about him, remembering the good parts of his life. Now, the words from Daniel's letter echoed in my head. Sometimes money shows you who someone really is. I looked down at the lockbox again, at the deed, at the account statement, at the letter written in the same careful handwriting I had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists for 20 years. Daniel was not hiding money, he was hiding it from someone. I closed the lockbox slowly and turned the key until the lock clicked again. When I stood up, my legs felt unsteady, but my decision was already made. The cabin, the account, the letter, those would remain my secret. For now. Because if Daniel had gone to this much trouble to protect them, there had to be a reason. And suddenly, I realized something that made the quiet house feel different. The people Daniel was worried about were already here, sitting downstairs in my living room.
Chapter 2. Questions that didn't feel like grief. I stood there for a moment after locking the box, listening to the quiet murmur of voices downstairs. For the first time since Daniel died, the house felt unfamiliar, like the walls were holding their breath. When I finally walked down the stairs, the conversation in the living room softened. Daniel's mother, Lorraine, sat on the couch with her hands folded in her lap. At 72, she carried the same composed posture she always had, her silver hair pinned neatly behind her ears. Michelle sat beside her, while Tyler leaned against the arm of the sofa, scrolling through his phone. Daniel's older brother, Robert, stood near the window, looking out toward the driveway. They all turned when they saw me. "There you are," Robert said. His voice sounded warm enough, but the way his eyes moved across the room reminded me of a man evaluating a property. "We were just talking about Daniel," Lorraine added, gently. I nodded and took a seat in the armchair across from them. For a few minutes, the conversation stayed safe. Lorraine talked about the time Daniel built her a new porch step after she twisted her ankle. Michelle laughed about how he used to burn pancakes every Sunday morning. It almost felt normal. Then Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook. "Ilara," he said, "there are a few things we should probably go over." My stomach tightened slightly. "Like what?" He opened the notebook and flipped to a blank page. "Just some practical stuff, paperwork, accounts, that kind of thing. I know this week has been overwhelming." Lorraine nodded in agreement. "Your father handled all those things when he passed," she said. "Robert is only trying to make things easier for you." Robert tapped his pen against the page. "First question is insurance. Did Daniel have life insurance through work?" "40,000, I said. His pen paused. "That is not very much." "It is enough," I replied. He wrote something down anyway. "What about retirement accounts? Did Daniel ever mention his company plan?" I shook my head. Robert continued writing. "Mortgage balance on the house?" I set my coffee cup down slowly. "Robert, I think I can handle my own finances." He lifted both hands in a gesture that looked like reassurance. "Of course you can. I'm just helping you keep track of things." Michelle leaned forward. "You would be surprised how much paperwork comes up after someone dies." Tyler nodded. "You do not want anything slipping through the cracks." Robert glanced around the kitchen. "This house is, what, around 3,000 square feet?" "About that," I said. "Big place for one person." The way he said it made my chest tighten. "I will manage." He shrugged. "Just saying, real estate around here is doing pretty well lately." Lorraine gave him a small look. "Robert, maybe this conversation can wait." He closed the notebook. "Sure, whenever you're ready." But the questions did not stop. Over the next several days, Robert called twice asking if I had located Daniel's retirement accounts. Michelle sent a message asking whether the utilities had been transferred to my name yet. Lorraine asked if the property taxes had already been paid this year. None of the questions sounded like grief. They sounded like inheritance. A week later, Michelle showed up at the house carrying 2 cardboard boxes. "I thought we could start going through Daniel's clothes," she said when I opened the door. Her voice was soft enough that I couldn't refuse. We carried the boxes upstairs and opened the closet. For a while, we worked quietly. Michelle slid shirts off hangers and folded them into piles, while I sat on the edge of the bed holding one of Daniel's sweaters in my hands. "Some of these could go to donation centers," she said. "There are families who could really use them." I nodded, even though my throat felt tight. She held up one of Daniel's jackets. "He always looked good in this." "Yes," I said quietly. Eventually, the closet began to look emptier. When Michelle left later that afternoon, the house felt even larger than before. That evening, I went into the bedroom to put away a few things we had missed. That was when I noticed the watch case. The small wooden box Daniel kept in his dresser was open. Inside, there had always been 3 watches: his everyday watch, a stainless steel diver he wore on vacations, and the one he valued the most, his grandfather's Omega. The slot where it belonged was empty. At first, I assumed Michelle had moved it while we were cleaning. I checked the dresser drawers, the closet shelf, the bathroom counter. Nothing. I told myself it wasn't important. Maybe Daniel had put it somewhere before he died. Maybe I was simply forgetting where it was. A few days later, Lorraine invited everyone over for Sunday dinner. She said it would be good for the family to spend time together again. When I arrived, the dining room smelled like roasted chicken and rosemary. Robert sat at the table reading something on his phone. Michelle poured drinks while Tyler carried a basket of bread into the room. We sat down and began eating. The conversation stayed light at first. Then Tyler reached across the table to grab the salt. That was when I saw it. I froze, because I knew that watch. The silver Omega caught the dining room light as Tyler's wrist moved across the table. The same dark blue dial, the same faint scratch across the glass Daniel once told me about. My eyes stayed fixed on it. Tyler noticed. He glanced down at his wrist. "Oh, this," he said casually. Michelle smiled. "I found it while we were sorting Daniel's dresser the other day." My voice came out quieter than I expected. That watch belonged to Daniel's grandfather. Tyler glanced briefly at Michelle before answering. "Well, someone should wear it." Michelle shrugged. "It would have just stayed in a drawer otherwise." Robert didn't even look up from his phone. Lorraine continued passing dishes down the table like nothing unusual had happened. I looked around the room slowly. No one seemed uncomfortable. No one seemed to think anything had been taken without asking. And suddenly the pattern became clear. Daniel had not been paranoid. He had been preparing. Because the people sitting at that table were not mourning him anymore. They were quietly dividing the pieces of his life they thought belonged to them.
Chapter 3. The Day They Tried to Sell My House. The thought followed me for days after that dinner. Every time I replayed the moment Tyler lifted his wrists and the light caught Daniel's watch, something inside me tightened. It was not just the watch. It was the way no one hesitated, no one asked, no one even looked uncomfortable. They simply assumed it was theirs. For the first time since Daniel died, I started paying attention to everything. 2 weeks passed before the next moment that made the pattern impossible to ignore. It was a quiet Tuesday morning. I had just returned from the grocery store and was setting a bag of coffee on the kitchen counter when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Robert stood on the porch. Beside him stood a man I had never seen before, wearing a construction jacket and holding a tablet. Robert smiled like this was a normal visit. "Morning, Ilara. What are you doing here?" "Just stopping by to check on the house." The man next to him stepped forward slightly. "Carl Simmons, roof inspector." I frowned. "Roof inspection?" Robert gestured toward the roof. "Just routine. Houses around here need maintenance checks every few years." Something about the explanation felt wrong. I had never called anyone to inspect my roof, which meant someone else had. Carl was already walking toward the side of the house. Within seconds, he had a ladder against the gutter and was climbing toward the roof. I stepped onto the porch and crossed my arms. For several minutes, he walked slowly along the shingles, tapping them with a small metal tool. Then he climbed down. Instead of leaving, he began circling the house. He measured the distance between the garage and the fence. He took photographs of the siding. He crouched near the foundation of the garage and typed notes into his tablet. Finally, I walked down the porch steps toward Robert. "What exactly are you doing?" He leaned casually against the railing. "Just checking the condition of the property." "For what reason?" Robert gave a small shrug. You should know what your biggest asset is worth. Carl finished his inspection and nodded toward Robert before walking back to his truck. Robert stayed a moment longer, glancing across the yard. Nice place you and Daniel built here. Then he followed Carl down the driveway and drove away. 3 days later, the doorbell rang again. When I opened the door, Robert stood there once more, but this time he was not alone. A woman in a navy blazer stood beside him holding a slim leather folder. Robert stepped inside before I had fully opened the door. Ilara, this is Dana Mercer. She extended a hand. I work with Horizon Realty. I did not shake it. Robert walked into the living room like he had every right to be there. Dana followed him, glancing around the room. Nice hardwood floors, large windows. She stepped closer to the dining room and looked toward the backyard. This property has great light, she said. Buyers love that. My chest tightened. Why is a realtor in my house? Robert leaned casually against the kitchen counter. We are exploring options. Dana opened her folder and began making notes. Some homes in this neighborhood are selling very quickly right now, she said. She walked slowly through the living room. In the current market, this could easily list around $560,000. Robert nodded like he had expected the number. That is exactly what I was thinking. I stared at him. Why are you discussing listing prices? Robert folded his arms. You living here alone might not be the most practical situation. I said nothing. He continued. If the market stays strong, selling now could be smart. Dana shifted uncomfortably. Some homeowners choose to downsize after a major life change. Robert looked directly at me. We're thinking about putting the house on the market. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. We? I repeated the word slowly. Robert did not hesitate. Ilara, the family helped with the down payment when you and Daniel bought this place in 2016. My jaw tightened. That was a gift. Robert glanced toward the doorway where Lorraine had quietly appeared. Lorraine spoke calmly. We always believed it was an investment in the family. Robert continued. $40,000 is not a small contribution. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. I looked around the room. Daniel's grocery list was still taped to the refrigerator. Milk, coffee, bread. The wooden kitchen table still had the small scratches where Daniel used to drag his chair back too quickly. Robert was talking about it like it was a piece of inventory. Dana closed her folder slowly, she said. This would actually be perfect for resale. That was the moment something inside me hardened. You should leave, I said. Robert looked surprised. We're only trying to help. I walked to the front door and opened it. You need to go. Dana stepped past him first, clearly uncomfortable. Robert hesitated, studying my face. Then he walked out without another word. The house felt colder that night. I went upstairs to the small study Daniel used for paperwork. The filing cabinet beside his desk had always been organized with careful precision. Tax returns, insurance policies, utility records. Then I noticed a folder labeled Family. My hands slowed. Inside were copies of several checks Daniel had written over the years. $8,000, $10,000, another $8,000. Each check written to Lorraine Whitmore, each dated months after we bought the house. The memo lines were simple. Repayment. Final installment. I spread the papers across the desk. For several minutes, I just stared at them. Then I took out my phone and photographed every single document. Robert believed he was dealing with a grieving widow who didn't understand money. But Daniel had left something more powerful than the hidden cabin or the investment account. He had left proof. And in that quiet room, I finally understood something important. This was no longer about grief. This was evidence.
Chapter 4. The Lien. The moment I finished photographing those checks, I knew I could not handle this alone. For the first time since Daniel died, the grief inside me shifted into something sharper. The situation was no longer just emotional, it was legal, and Robert had just made it a legal fight. 2 days later, I drove into downtown Franklin and parked outside a small brick office building a block from the county courthouse. The brass sign beside the door read, "Whitaker and Mills, Attorneys at Law." Inside the waiting room, the air smelled faintly of paper and fresh coffee. A receptionist sat behind a desk, typing quietly. She looked up as I walked in. "Can I help you?" I gave my name. "I have an appointment with Michael Chen." She nodded and gestured toward a chair. "He will be with you in a moment." 10 minutes later, a tall man in his early 40s stepped into the waiting room. "Ilara Whitmore?" I stood. "Yes." He extended his hand. "Michael Chen." His office was lined with shelves of legal books and framed county property maps. A large window looked out toward the courthouse steps across the street. Michael motioned for me to sit across from his desk. "Tell me what is going on." I placed the folder in front of him. "My husband passed away 3 weeks ago." He nodded slowly. "I am sorry for your loss." Then I began explaining everything. Robert showing up with the roof inspector, the realtor walking through my living room, the conversation about selling the house. Michael listened without interrupting. When I finished, he reached for the deed document inside the folder. "Let me see the house title." He read the property title carefully, his eyes moving slowly across the page. After a moment, he nodded. "This property was purchased under joint tenancy." "What does that mean?" "It means that when your husband passed away, the full ownership transferred automatically to you." "So Robert has no claim to the house?" "None." Michael placed the document back on the desk. "Unless someone tries to create a claim." The way he said it made my stomach tighten slightly. 2 days later, that possibility became real. The certified letter arrived on Saturday morning. I recognized the county seal immediately. My hands began to shake as I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal notice from the Williamson County Records Office. A lien had been filed against the property, filed by Robert Whitmore. The document claimed the Whitmore family had provided an unpaid loan toward the purchase of the house. Until the lien was resolved, the property title would remain clouded, which meant the house could not legally be sold. For several seconds, I stared at the paper. Then I grabbed my phone. Michael answered on the second ring. "You received the notice?" "Yes." His voice stayed calm. "This is a fraudulent lien, but it still has to go through the legal process. What happens now?" "We challenge it." He paused briefly. "Do you still have the repayment checks you mentioned?" "Yes." "Bring them to my office today." 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him again. Michael examined each document carefully. $8,000, $10,000, $8,000. He nodded slowly. "These are strong." He slid the papers back toward me. "Robert claims the family loan was never repaid. These checks show the opposite." Michael opened a new file and began organizing copies of the documents. "We will file a formal lien challenge with the county records office." "How long will that take?" "Usually a few weeks." He looked up. "Once the county reviews the evidence, the lien should be removed." That night, my phone rang just after 9. "Robert?" I stared at the screen before answering. "What do you want?" His voice sounded relaxed. "Looks like things got complicated. You filed a false lien against my house. We filed a claim. You are lying." Robert chuckled softly. "Prove it." The line went silent for a moment. Then he hung up. A confidence in his voice stayed with me long after the call ended. 9 days passed. During that time, Michael submitted the lien challenge along with copies of Daniel's repayment checks. Then something unexpected happened. Michael called me late one afternoon. His voice sounded different. "Ilara, something new came up." What kind of something? "The county records investigator contacted me this morning." Why would an investigator be involved? Because when they reviewed the house title and lien filing, they discovered something unusual. My chest tightened. What did they find? Robert recently applied for a bridge loan. From where? Tri-County Community Credit Union. I frowned. Why does that matter? Michael spoke slowly. Because in the loan application, Robert listed expected proceeds from the future sale of your property. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. My house? Yes, but he does not own it. Exactly. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Michael continued. The investigator believes Robert used the projected sale of your property as collateral to secure the loan. How much money? $38,000. I leaned back in the chair. Robert had already borrowed money based on a house he believed he could force me to sell. Michael lowered his voice slightly. The investigator forwarded the information to the county legal department. What does that mean? It means Robert may have created a legal problem he cannot easily explain. For the first time since Daniel died, something inside me shifted. Robert believed he had trapped me with paperwork. Instead, he had created a trail of documents. And paper trails have a way of leading somewhere very specific, toward the truth, and toward a mistake Robert would not be able to undo. Chapter 5. The Cabin. The days after the county removed the lien were strangely quiet. For weeks, the tension around the house had felt like a storm waiting to break. Every phone call had made my stomach tighten. Every knock on the door had made my heart race. But suddenly, the noise stopped. The call from Michael came on a calm Monday afternoon while I was sitting at the kitchen table sorting through old paperwork. I answered immediately. "The lien has been removed." For a moment, I did not respond. "Just like that?" "Yes. The county reviewed the house title documents and the repayment checks. The filing was dismissed as unsupported." I closed my eyes and leaned back in the chair. The pressure that had been building inside my chest for weeks finally loosened. "So it is finished?" "Legally, yes." Michael paused. "But there is something else you should know." I straightened slightly. "What is it?" "The investigator reviewing the loan paperwork connected to Robert's bridge loan found something serious." My stomach tightened again. "What kind of serious?" "Robert listed projected proceeds from the future sale of your house as an asset in the loan application." "I know." Michael exhaled quietly. "The credit union has opened a fraud review because the collateral he described does not belong to him." The room went still. What happens now? That part is out of our hands, but it will not be easy for him to explain. After the call ended, I sat at the table staring at the quiet kitchen. For weeks, this house had felt like a battleground. Now it felt almost unfamiliar. Robert stopped calling. Lorraine never appeared at the door again. Even Tyler's messages disappeared. It was like the entire family had quietly stepped away the moment the paperwork turned against them. Michael sent me one more message about 10 days later. The State Real Estate Licensing Board opened a conduct review connected to Robert's actions. Apparently, the credit union filed a report when they realized the loan was based on property he did not own. I read the message twice. Robert had spent weeks acting like the smartest person in the room, but arrogance always leaves a trail, and paper trails rarely stay hidden. Still, the house no longer felt like the place where I could start over. Every room held memories of the last month, the arguments, the tension, the constant fear that someone might try to take what Daniel and I had built together. One evening, I stood in the living room looking around the quiet space and realized something simple. Daniel had already given me another option, one Robert never knew existed. The next morning, I packed a small bag and locked the front door. The drive north took nearly 2 hours. The highway wound through farmland and small towns before the road narrowed into a quiet stretch of forest. Eventually, the trees opened and the lake appeared. Lake Hartwell stretched across the horizon like a sheet of blue glass, reflecting the afternoon sun. The cabin Daniel bought sat quietly near the shoreline. Tall pine trees surrounded the property on 3 sides. 2 small bedrooms, a wooden porch facing the water. I parked the car and stepped out slowly. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. Wind moved softly through the trees. Water touched the rocks along the shore. No voices, no tension, just quiet. I reached into my bag and pulled out the brass key Daniel had left for me. The metal felt cool against my fingers. The key turned easily in the door. Inside the cabin, everything smelled like pine and fresh wood. Sunlight poured through wide windows facing the lake. A stone fireplace stood against one wall. A small wooden table sat near the kitchen window. Daniel had furnished the place simply, but everything felt warm and calm. I walked slowly through the rooms. The bedrooms were small but comfortable. The bathroom held neatly folded towels Daniel must have purchased before he died. When I opened the kitchen cabinet, I noticed something tucked beside a row of glasses. A folded piece of paper. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Daniel's. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. I thought we would spend summers here someday. That was all it said. But the meaning behind those words filled the room. Daniel must have imagined mornings here. Coffee on the porch, quiet afternoons watching the lake, long evenings when the water turned gold under the sunset. And somehow he knew this place might become more important than he originally planned. He had not just left me an inheritance, he had left me distance. Distance from the arguments, distance from the family greed that had revealed itself so quickly after he died. Distance from the house that had become the center of every conflict. I stepped back to the door and hung the brass key on a small hook beside the frame. The cabin was not large, it was not expensive, but it was peaceful. Robert had tried to take the house. He believed that was the most valuable thing Daniel left behind. But Daniel understood something Robert never did. Safety is not always about property. Sometimes it's about knowing exactly where you can breathe again. I stepped onto the porch and sat quietly facing the lake. For the first time since the hospital, my thoughts felt steady. Daniel had protected me in ways I did not fully understand until now, and Robert had made a mistake that could not be undone. Situations involving money, inheritance, and family greed can reveal sides of people we never expected to see. I am curious what you think. If you had been in my situation, would you have fought the family over the house, or would you have chosen the quiet peace of walking away? Tell me what you would have done. If you value stories where strength is quiet but unshakable, subscribe and comment.